autumn of 1862, in the second year of the American Civil War, Confederate and Union armies came together in a savage battle. Antietam. In the days that followed, a Scots-born photographer, Alexander Gardner, captured shocking images of death and disfigurement.
Here along the Hagerstown Pike, they found men lying on the field as they fell, and they were in all sorts of different poses. Rigor mortis had set in.
No one had ever seen a battlefield before, and they certainly had never seen the way a battlefield looked when the battle was over.
A century on, David Hume Kennelly won a Pulitzer Prize for his pictures of another American war.
There are some similarities between my work and Gardner. In Vietnam, I have a picture of the soldier going over a blown-away hillside. He has a photograph that's very similar.
David Kennelly photographed 4 decades of American presidents. Alexander Gardner captured the final 4 years of Abraham Lincoln. No photographer got closer to America's great wartime leader.
He was the first photographer to just go in tight and focused on the eyes, the intense look into somebody's soul.
From the first battles to the final retribution, Gardner's pictures framed the whole agonizing story.
That is the most amazing photo. To tell the story in one frame is what it's all about.
He really was a great photographer. I would have put him up against any photographer I've ever seen in my life.
Witness to the most turbulent decade in American history, the founding father of photojournalism, Alexander Gardner was the Scot who shot the American Civil War. David Kennelly has come to Washington, D.C. in search of his enigmatic predecessor.
The 2 Alexander Gardners, big beard. He has a bow and an arrow.
That's a photograph in a costume out of the old Wild West.
It seems like a kind of a touristy photo, right? Like you send this back, here's America, this is the way they all dress, this is the Indian get-up, right?
Absolutely.
Send it back to Scotland.
Alexander Gardner's great American adventure began in New York. He arrived in 1856. It was the right place, it was the right time. The city had fallen in love with portrait photography. Gardner was something of an expert. Born in Paisley, he was a political radical and a man of many talents. A trained jeweler, a newspaper editor, and a portrait photographer. He found work at New York's most famous studio, 359 Broadway. Headquarters of America's greatest photographer, the celebrated Matthew Brady, and his self-styled National Portrait Gallery.
This moment in time, sort of more is more. I mean, you could never have too much stuff, too much gold, too many drapes, too much fringe, too many frames, too many mirrors, too many anything. So it really would be floor-to-ceiling pictures. One of the people who came here was the Prince of Wales. His first visit to America, the first visit of British royalty to America, one of the people on his itinerary was Brady. Anybody whose name would be in the paper, Brady wanted to have come to his gallery.
The Great Hall of Portraits was only one part of the Brady operation. Upstairs, camera operators like Alexander Gardner would put on their overalls and photograph the famous.
This picture looks like Gardner wearing his everyday work clothes in a way.
Now, this is a studio self-portrait in which Gardner sits in sort of this famous chair that presidents and all sorts of other political, military leaders of the day had sat in. And there he is sitting in it in his very sort of typical studio dress. But there's a relaxed quality, a kind of casualness. He is somebody who exhibits a great deal of self-confidence.
Photographers of the 1850s were not considered artists. Gardner was a camera operator under the direction of the visionary Matthew Brady. Together, their job relied on long exposures and the cooperation of the sun.
Your chair or your table would be right under the skylight. We can see the skylight here with those plates of glass focusing all the light down onto the sitter. They had a big stand that clamped you in place so that you wouldn't move. You would stay perfectly in focus. All the time you've been sitting under this light, just waiting and waiting. It couldn't have been fun.
Brady's studio was the most famous in New York, but his methods were old-fashioned. Daguerreotypes, images fixed on metal plates that were impossible to copy. Gardner arrived with the newest European technology, using a chemical called collodion to make glass negatives that offered unlimited prints.
If you wanted one for yourself and one for your mother, you could do it. Or one for the office and one for home, you could do it. Or one for your campaign for president and one for the newspaper, you could do it.
One campaign in particular. Early in 1860, a little-known Illinois lawyer came to New York. His speech to the Cooper Union established his manifesto. Taken the very same day, a Brady studio photograph established his identity. His name was Abraham Lincoln.
It's a very sort of deliberate sort of setup, the sort of false column that's you see a portion of in the background, or the table with a book on it. You know, wants to insert him into this portrait style.
Well, what's fascinating about it to me too, Lincoln had a real sense of promotion. And Lincoln said, this picture and my Cooper Union speech made me president. So that's a powerful image. But really until JFK, there was no one that understood the power of the image, I think, as well as Lincoln did.
Yeah, I completely agree. Lincoln is the first president to understand the political importance of photography, this new visual technology that he could use to his advantage, and none of his predecessors got that.
Lincoln campaigned to restrict slavery, a policy that appealed to the liberal sensibilities of Alexander Gardner. Back in Scotland, Gardner had edited the radical Glasgow Sentinel newspaper. He had called slavery
a stain on the escutcheon of the otherwise freest country in the world.
Lincoln's victory in the election of 1860 tore that country apart. The southern slave-owning states began to leave the Union. Civil war seemed almost inevitable. Washington would be at the center of that war. And at the center of Washington was a new photographic studio. The Brady franchise had arrived in the heart of the nation's capital.
The location itself was excellent. It was less than a mile away from the U.S. Capitol, less than a mile away from the White House, less than a mile away from all the key buildings in Washington, D.C. It's across from Market Square here in Washington, where everybody was.
Brady needed someone he could trust to manage his new Washington operation. He chose Alexander Gardner. The humble photographer had arrived at the very center of American political life. And he wouldn't be the last.
Time magazine gave me the assignment to photograph Gerald R. Ford Ford then was chosen to be the vice president replacing Agnew, and I spent a lot of time traveling around with him, covering him for time, got to know the family. So when he became president, August 9th, 1974, he offered me the job as his White House photographer. And I said, well, Mr. President, which was, they call him Mr. President, he'd only been president about 8 hours. I said, there's only 2 things I would like. And I thought about this, and I want total access, and I want to work directly for you, not the White House press secretary or anybody else. And he kind of looked at me, and he said, you don't want Air Force One on the weekends.
Kennerly took the job. He's photographed every president since.
This picture of Clinton was taken in the Oval Office. He was talking to families of the Pan Am 103 plane that was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland, and you could see how serious he is, and he was really affected by what he was hearing from these people who had lost their loved ones on that airplane. So that's what photography is all about. It's peeling back a layer of somebody's personality and illuminating that for other people.
Alexander Gardner would also capture the character and concerns of his president. In February 1861, a deeply troubled Abraham Lincoln arrived at Matthew Brady's Washington studio. And the man from Paisley was to take his picture.
Can you imagine Lincoln sitting in this room and what is on his mind? He's arrived in Washington. There's controversy over that in the first place. He's yet to be inaugurated. And when he is coming to the head of a country that is falling apart. You talk about some weighty issues, and here he is, possibly for some moments of enjoyable solitude while he's having this picture taken. Nobody's calling on him, and what must be running through his head in this room is incredible to contemplate.
Lincoln is making his face available to sort of the larger public.
His face is now bearded, by the way.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting detail, because from the time when he was elected in November of 1860 to his inauguration, he grows a beard, and historians have speculated on why that might be, whether he wanted to look more like the generals that he was going to be leading.
Gardner took 5 very similar portraits of an impatient president.
Lincoln sat very still for most of them, other than that he pulled his pocket watch out of his pocket and must have looked at it, because in one of the pictures, the watch actually appears. There is no record, very frustratingly, of any interactions between Gardner and Abraham Lincoln and the assistants while they were here, but one of the assistants did say that Lincoln looked careworn already, and I'm sure that's a huge understatement.
On the 4th of March, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated president. 27 of the 34 states remained in the Union. A month later, in Charleston Harbor, the Union stronghold of Fort Sumter was captured by rebel forces. The first flag of the Confederates, the Stars and Bars, flew above the battered fort. The Civil War had begun.
Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. That many and more end up coming to Washington, D.C., and all these soldiers want a picture of themselves in uniform before this war is over. They all think it's going to be a short war at that time.
Taking pictures of soldiers clamped into place in a warm, dry studio was straightforward. Taking pictures in the field of the approaching war promised to be much more difficult.